In this video, we will show you how to replace your front air shock on this Jeep Grand Cherokee. This will be located inside of your front wheel well. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. The first thing I want to mention is you will have to have a scan tool to be able to deflate your air suspension system and then be able to reinflate it in the end. Not only that, but you will have to go to a trained professional to have the nitrogen tank measured and refilled if needed after this process. One of the first things we have to do is have the vehicle running, and we need to have the suspension in the park setting. Start lowering this down. Let's bring this all the way down. Now once your suspension is in the park setting, we can go ahead and turn off the vehicle, but we are going to have it in the run position. Now it's time to have a look at our scanner. Now, of course, every scan tool is going to be a little bit different, but if you were to go into specialty test under the suspension, what we're going to be looking for is spring deflate to reservoir. We'll just go ahead and press on that. It's going to ask me, are we sure we want to do this? Of course I am. Now it's going to ask me which one of the air springs we're going to be working on, so you'd want to choose that one accordingly. Now it's asking me if I want to do a short time deflate or a complete deflate. Since I'm replacing the entire spring, let's do a complete deflate. You can hear the system deflating as it should. We'll just wait until it's all done the noise. All right, sounds like it's done. We'll turn off key power. Continuing on, we'll make our way under the hood. Along each side of the vehicle, you're going to find your front shock tower. We're going to dislodge the line that leads along the top. Keep in mind, there could still be some pressure in this system. To disconnect this, I'll be using a 12mm. We're going to loosen this fitting right up along the top of the shock. Now that we have that off of there, we're just going to give this a quick inspection. But let's pause up inside the engine compartment and safely raise and support the front of the vehicle. With the vehicle raised up in the air and the suspension hanging, we'll continue on removing the wheel by removing each of our 22mm lug nuts. We can get the wheel off of here. Now that we have the wheel out of the way, let's remove our 32mm axle nut and then break the axle free from the hub located just behind it. To help break this free, I'm just using a hammer and punch directly in the center of the axle. Now that we have the axle nut off of there, I'm going to use that as a spacer. Slide it over one of the lug studs and install one of the lug nuts. That'll hold the rotor in place so no miscellaneous debris falls behind it, causing a brake pulsation. The outer tie rod end is located along the front aspect of your knuckle here. We'll remove the 21mm lug nut. A quick inspection, start it back on a couple threads. We'll give the knuckle a couple taps with a hammer and separate this area. Otherwise, if you happen to have a joint separator, you could use that as well. Now on my application itself, I could see that the tie rod already moved, but typically, like I said, start the nut on there, we'll tap on this, and wait till you see it separate. Once it has separated, you can just go ahead and take that right off of there, slide the tie rod out of there, and give it a close inspection. Let's make our way back along the rear here. We're going to separate the ABS wire from our flex hose. On the flex hose itself, it does have some plastic brackets. You just want to separate the two locking ears, slide it right on out of there. A quick inspection as we make our way up. We'll slide it out of the mounting bracket on the flex hose as well. At this point, we have plenty of slack from this. You want to be extremely careful not to cause any damage along the way. After separating that, we're going to pay attention along the back of the brake caliper. You're going to find that you have two 21mm mounting bolts holding this in place. We'll remove the upper bolt. A quick inspection, start it back in a couple threads, and then fully remove the lower bolt. Continuing from here, carefully remove the caliper with the brake pads still attached. We'll give those brake pads a quick inspection. If it looks like they're worn at an angle or damaged, you definitely want to do a brake job. These are brand new, so we'll carefully set the caliper aside, putting no pressure on our flex hose. Now remaining along the backside here, You can see the through bolt that goes through the front shock, through the control arm. We're going to pause on that and move ahead to removing the sway bar link mounting nut. To be able to remove this 18mm nut, you want to make sure you hold on to the stud of the sway bar link so it doesn't spin on you while you're trying to remove the nut. To do this, I'm going to use some locking pliers on the forward side, holding onto it, but being extremely careful for the boot. Now we can remove this nut. Once you have it out of there, you just want to give everything a close inspection. Continuing from here, we're going to carefully apply upward pressure underneath our lower control arm. We don't need very much, just enough that we can remove this mounting bolt. Once you have support under there, we're going to move along to our 21mm mounting bolt. You can see the head of it coming through from the rear towards the front. Along the front of this, there's a 24mm mounting nut. I'm going to use my 24mm wrench on the front, and we'll remove the bolt from along the back side here. Now I'm just going to tap this out of here, use a punch and a hammer on the backside. Now we'll raise or lower the suspension as needed. There's that. Now we're going to gain focus all the way up at the upper ball joint. The upper ball joint is attached to the upper control arm, makes its way down through your steering knuckle. We're going to remove the 21mm mounting nut. A quick inspection, start it back on a couple threads, and we'll tap on this area lightly, causing vibration to help separate it. Continuing from here, take hold of the control arm. You should be able to pull it down. If you feel as though you have a hard time, you could use a small pry bar. Just be extremely careful. Now, as we start pulling this away, we need to pay attention to our axle. We want to make sure the axle is going through the wheel hub. Continuing from here, we're going to lower the support from underneath the control arm. We're paying attention in this area. We want the lower control arm to separate from that lower aspect of the front shock. We'll pivot this down. Now we're paying attention to where the axle is right along the backside here. We have to carefully pull this out and away. We're going to be fully removing the axle from the differential as well. There we are. Back up in the engine compartment, we're going to remove 2 of our 13mm headed mounting nuts. And once we're going to remove the third one, we need to make sure we're holding onto the front shock so it doesn't fall down and potentially damage your axle boot. Now we're going to follow the axle in. We have to dislodge it from inside this area. To do this, you can use an axle removal tool or just a pry bar. Make my way right in behind here. We'll gently start prying this out and away. Now that we have it separated, let's take hold of it and pull it out and away. Continuing from here, we're going to start pulling the axle down and out through here. We're being extremely careful for both of our axle boots at all times. Now it's time for the final mounting bolt. We'll make sure we're holding onto that shock. Carefully start pulling this down and out of here. There it is, friend. Now we can install our brand new front shock. We'll carefully get this in position. I'm just going to swing this in. While we bring this up against the body of the vehicle, we're trying to align those mounting studs. Once you have them started on there, go ahead and snug them up. The torque for these is 21 foot-pounds. Now let's pause before torquing this until we get everything back together and the full weight of the vehicle back on the ground. Making our way back into the wheel well, before we can reinstall our axle half shaft, we need to pay attention to where it mounts to deep in here. You can see a rubber seal. Give it a quick wipe, a close inspection, make sure it's not dry rotted and cracked or gonna leak in any way. If it looks like it's damaged, now's the time to replace it. Once you do have it cleaned and inspected, go ahead and apply a thin amount of petroleum jelly as a lubricant. Let's use a glove finger for this. Next, we're going to have to carefully start pulling down on that control arm and reinstalling the axle. We'll have to bring it in between the control arm and the front strut. Continuing on from here, we're going to the inboard portion of the axle. We'll get this aligned, being extremely careful for our seal, and we'll press this into place. When you go to press this in, you're going to find that it typically wants to stop before it's completely bottomed out. That's due to a snap ring. We're going to have to take hold of this and carefully start pressing it in. Now as you drove that in, once it feels as though it's bottomed out, take hold of the inboard side, not the boot, the inboard metal area here, and we're trying to pull it out and away. If it slides out, it's not locked in, you need to continue pressing it in. Once you're confirmed that you're locked in, we'll continue on. Continuing on, we're going to have to do several things at the same time. We want to make sure we're prepared to be able to raise the suspension, so have something under there so you can jack it up as necessary. After that, we're going to be focusing on the far end of the axle. We need to make sure it comes in and behind the knuckle, behind the bearing, and out through the far end. Just get that through there. There it is. Now the next thing we have to do is carefully start putting the axle shaft in and through along the back side of the steering knuckle here. We have the wheel bearing. As that starts pushing its way through, we're going to be pushing the upper portion of the steering knuckle in. While this is happening, we need to pay attention to the lower suspension here. I want to have my control arm aligned with the lower aspect of the shock. You may have to raise or lower it as necessary. You can use a jack too if needed. The lower bolt goes through from the backside towards the front there. We're just going to have to align it at the same time as pressing it in. We'll just tap this through. Start on the mounting nut. Let's pause down here and make our way to the upper ball joint. While aligning the upper ball joint with the steering knuckle, you're going to have to raise the suspension. It can only go up so far. Continuing from there, you'd want to pull down on the upper control arm as necessary. Continuing on, we'll go ahead and snug this up. The torque for your upper ball joint nut is 70 foot-pounds. When you go to torque your nut, you're going to find that the knuckle wants to spin on you. To help prevent that, you can use some long pliers or a 17mm wrench. Hold onto the steering knuckle and apply pressure. We're trying to prevent this from turning too far because you don't want to cause any damage to your axle. While applying upward pressure, we'll continue on with tightening our lower mounting hardware, holding the front shock to the lower control arm. This time, I'm holding the head of the bolt with a 21mm. I'm going to tighten the nut with a 24mm, and we'll torque this to 173 foot-pounds. Wrench. Once you have that torqued, you can release pressure from underneath your front suspension. Now it's time to insert the sway bar link into the port in the lower control arm. You may find that you have to flex the sway bar up or down to get this aligned. Just use a pry bar for this. Continuing on from here, we'll be installing our mounting nut along the rear of this. We'll be holding the stud in place with our locking pliers, being careful for the boot. Start on your 18mm nut. Snug it up. The torque for this is 90 foot-pounds. After torquing the sway bar link, we're continuing on to our outer tie rod end. We'll pivot this, align it. After that, we have our 21mm mounting nut. Just start that on by hand. Snug it up. The torque for this is 70 foot-pounds. When you go to tighten this, if you find that the stud wants to spin on you while you continue, use a pry bar. Make your way underneath the tie rod end, all the way over to something you can pry against, and apply upward pressure. You could also use a jack if necessary. Let's make our way to our brake caliper. We've already inspected the brake pads. The next thing we'll do is slide the caliper and pads over the brake rotor. Once you have it slid into position, we'll continue on with our two 21mm bolts. Use some blue thread locker. Start them in, snug them up. Torque those to 148 foot-pounds. After torquing the caliper, we'll continue on to our ABS wire. That's going to press right into the plastic clips that are on that brake flex hose. If your clips are broken and it doesn't hold the ABS wire, use some wire ties. You want to make sure it is properly secured so it does not get damaged. Continuing on from here, we're going to remove the lug nut and our axle nut that we used as the spacer. But before we install that nut, let's make sure that we install some thread locker onto the axle. We'll start installing this by hand. You never want to use an impact tool when installing an axle nut because you could cause damage to the bearing, in which case you're going to have to replace it. If you find when tightening or torquing this wants to spin on you, you could have a second person inside of the vehicle holding the brake, or if it's just you, you could use a pry bar diagonally down to the ground. We're going to go across some of these studs, making sure that we're not at an angle where we can cause damage. Now that we have it bottomed out, torque it to 229 foot-pounds. One last quick inspection in this area, and we'll reinstall our wheel. Once you have your wheel in place, start on all 5 of your 22mm lug nuts. Bottom them out. We'll get the wheel safely back on the ground and torque each of these to 130 foot-pounds. We've got the wheel back on the ground. We'll be torquing these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Let's make our way back up under the hood. We're going to torque the upper mounting hardware. Back up in the engine compartment, we have the full weight of the vehicle on the ground. We can continue on with torquing these to 21 inch-pounds. Now we'll be using our 12mm. Go ahead and loosen up that fitting. Along the top of this, you're going to find you have a white adapter. That makes its way down and through the fitting, and it holds the collar. We'll leave it in as we continue pulling this out. Now we'll start installing this in here. Flex it as needed. Of course, you're going to start it in by hand. Here's our 12 millimeter, make sure it's nice and tight. At this point, you're going to have to go to a trained professional. What they're going to have to do is complete the refill procedure and then top off the nitrogen tank, which is located behind your rear driver's seat. After that, you can go ahead and take your vehicle for a road test. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.